Ringo Starr may have been one-fourth of one of the biggest rock bands in history, but he's also suffered more than his fair share of bad luck and dark times. In 1947, when Ringo Starr was just 6 years old, his appendix ruptured. As a result, he developed peritonitis, an inflammation of a tissue membrane that covers internal organs. What's worse, Starr's hospital stay ended up being twice as long as it should have been. He told NPR's Fresh Air in 2017, "I was in a year because 6 months in I was getting rather well, and I got excited and I fell out of bed and ripped open all these stitches in my stomach." Starr needed emergency surgery and an additional 6 months of recovery time. He was laid up in a Liverpool Children's Hospital for so long that he missed a full year of school. When he got out, he caught up to his classmates with the help of a tutor. Just a few years after his first long hospital stay, the now 13-year-old Starr was diagnosed with tuberculosis, one of the most contagious and potentially deadly diseases around at the time. Starr recalled, "It was like, 6 or 7 cases in every street where people were just in the living room dying of TB because they didn't have a cure, of course." Doctors sent Starr to what he called a greenhouse in the country, a sanitarium for children where he could breathe fresh air and be treated with the new miracle cure for TB called streptomycin. Starr spent around 2 years recovering from tuberculosis. He missed so much school that he never went back.
We got here, and just with the madness of it all, we landed with a #1 record. And so there was like 50,000 kids at the airport.
In 1964, Beatlemania hit big. The band's performances on The Ed Sullivan Show set viewership records. 5 Beatles songs occupied the top 5 slots on the Billboard Hot 100, and they would set off on a world tour to play in front of throngs of fans who screamed so loud they couldn't even hear the music. But during a London photo shoot in June 1964, Starr once again fell seriously ill. Taken to a hospital, he was diagnosed with both tonsillitis and pharyngitis, a severely sore throat, and was ordered to stay in bed. That was kind of a problem as the Beatles tour was due to kick off in Denmark the following day. Starr had no choice but to literally lay back and let the band replace him with producer George Martin's first suggestion, a session drummer named Jimmy Nicol. Starr recovered after 10 days, having missed shows in Australia and Asia, and rejoined the band. He was hugely relieved, sharing, "They'd taken Jimmy Nicol and I thought they didn't love me anymore. All that stuff went through my head." The breakup of the Beatles in 1970 left Starr feeling lost, and the stress of forging a solo career in the years after left him in a bad state. In 1989, he told People magazine, "I had a serious drinking problem. I didn't work or do anything. I wouldn't go out because you'd have to be in the car for 40 minutes without a drink." His cognac habit became legendary, and his blackouts continued to get worse. Starr admitted to the Daily Express in 2010, "I've got photographs of me playing all over the world, but I've absolutely no memory of it. I played Washington with the Beach Boys, or so they tell me, but there's only a photo to prove it." In 1989, he went to court to stop the release of an album he'd recorded during an especially booze-heavy period, testifying that he was drinking as many as 16 bottles of wine each day. But even though he knew he had a problem in the early 80s, Starr didn't seek help for years because he felt like he was stuck professionally. Speaking with Rolling Stone in 2019, he explained, "I don't know how you do anything if you're not drunk. I couldn't play sober, but I also couldn't play as a drunk." He credits forming Ringo Starr's all-star band and going on tour in 1989 as one of the factors that helped him kick alcohol for good. Not only did addiction have a hold over Ringo Starr, it also affected his second wife, actor Barbara Bach. Starr told People, "She fell into the trap because of me." According to Starr, Bach would try to get them both sober and then they'd fall back into old habits all over again. In the foreword to former Beatles press officer Derek Taylor's book on alcoholism, Getting Sober and Loving It, the couple wrote, "We used to go on long plane journeys, rent huge villas, stock up the bars, hide, and get deranged." Bach's daughter, Francesca Gregorini, spoke with the Mail on Sunday about the days when she lived with her mother and the former Beatle and said, "It was their drugs' heyday. They wanted nothing to do with anybody else. They were happy to just stay at home, drink, do drugs, and just hide away." Their rock star lifestyle landed them at rock bottom in late 1988. According to Andrew Grant Jackson's Beatles biography, Still the Greatest, Starr admitted, "I came to one Friday afternoon and was told by the staff that I trashed the house so badly they thought there had been burglars, and I trashed Barbara so badly they thought she was dead." In October 1988, Starr and Bach jointly checked into a rehab facility in Tucson, Arizona.
The force of John, that's why he's one of the greats. That's how it is.
In December 1980, a troubled fan named Mark David Chapman shot and killed former Beatles frontman John Lennon outside of his New York City apartment building, shocking fans all over the world. Starr spoke with Rolling Stone about the night he heard about Lennon's death, recalling, "I was in the Bahamas. I was getting a phone call from my stepkids in LA saying, 'Something's happened to John,' and they called and said, 'John's dead,' and I didn't know what to do." Starr immediately hopped on a plane to New York and went to the apartment Lennon shared with his wife, Yoko Ono, and their young son, Sean. He hung out for a while, offering comfort and support, playing with Sean and keeping him occupied to take his mind off the tragedy. But despite his brave face, there's no doubt that the tragedy absolutely wrecked Starr. In 1970, the Beatles broke up under a cloud of creative and personal differences. Hostilities between all four musicians would eventually vanish, though, and they'd all be friends again while frequently contributing to one another's solo projects. Following the death of John Lennon in 1980, Starr appeared on George Harrison's hit 1981 Beatles reflection tune All Those Years Ago, and they'd both play on Free as a Bird, a 1995 single credited to the Beatles that was built out of an unused John Lennon demo recording. Just 6 years after that reunion, in November 2001, Harrison died at age 58 following years of treatment for cancer. Starr knew Harrison was in his last days when he went to visit him at his home in Switzerland in late 2001. While appearing in the documentary George Harrison, Living in the Material World, he said, "He was very ill, he could only lay down. And while he was being ill and I had come to see him, I was going to Boston because my daughter had a brain tumor. It was the last words I heard him say, actually. He said, 'Do you want me to come with you?'" For decades, Starr has proudly talked about his healthy lifestyle habits. He adopted a vegetarian diet in the early 90s, embraced holistic and natural medical practices, and even into his 80s, he regularly exercises. But in 2022, he reportedly was very upset after coming down with the COVID-19 virus. Starr made a full recovery, but he had to cancel a series of tour dates. Even when he did feel well enough to perform, he decided to stay off the road and rest so as not to overtax his system. Just after his bout of COVID-19, Starr was diagnosed with another serious medical condition. He told Variety, "It was a mad thing eating my body, and they found out when they took my blood." Starr's white blood cell count was sky high, indicating that his body was fighting off a particularly strong infection. He explained, "They were fighting the attacker, and so with pills and medication, I got over it in 2 weeks." Even so, Starr had to cancel a number of tour dates. In 2021, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists published an exposé, known as the Pandora Papers, on the use of creative accounting methods and international money placement by wealthy celebrities. The ICIJ alleged that the rich people it looked into had established companies in the British Virgin Islands, Switzerland, Anguilla, and other countries where income taxes are low or non-existent. Starr's funds were then funneled through those accounts so they wouldn't count as taxable income in their home countries. Along with the likes of Shakira and Julio Iglesias, Starr was among the famous people named in the documents. At the time the report went public in October 2021, Starr's net worth was in the $400 million range. The ICIJ found documents that showed Starr or an agent acting on his behalf had set up 2 separate companies technically located in the Bahamas, which were then used to buy a home in the Los Angeles area. The musician additionally created 5 trusts in Panama. One trust received the money generated by Starr's royalty payments and concert performances, while 3 others owned life insurance policies that benefited Ringo Starr's adult children. On May 19, 1980, only months after their relationship began during the filming of the movie Caveman, Starr and Barbara Bach were headed to a party in Surrey. As Starr drove his Mercedes through foggy conditions, he entered a roundabout and didn't see a large truck heading his way. Driving at about 60 miles per hour, Starr quickly swerved to avoid a head-on collision but lost control of his vehicle in the process. The car skidded and flipped repeatedly before coming to rest about 50 yards away, and only stopped when and where it did after colliding with a pair of lampposts. Starr injured his leg in the crash, but he remained conscious and managed to pull Bach from the wreck safely. After he returned to the destroyed Mercedes to fetch a pack of cigarettes, Starr and Bach were taken to a nearby hospital and treated for minor injuries. The couple very nearly lost their lives in that moment. Starr proposed marriage 3 weeks later. Besides the Beatles themselves, only actor Victor Spinetti appeared in all the band's live-action scripted films. Spinetti had become a friend of the band by 1965 when they headed to the Caribbean to film Help, and thank goodness he went along, because he may have saved Starr's life. In the movie, Spinetti plays a villain who wants a valuable ring worn by Starr. The script called for Ringo to get away by jumping off a yacht into the sea. It was the first scene shot for Help, and Starr was doing his own stunts.
Wouldn't want me to go in with a blunt scalpel, now would we?
At a 2009 Beatles fan convention, Spinetti recalled, "So he dives off but quickly comes straight back out shivering because it was freezing and there were shark nets everywhere. It was actually very dangerous." The director planned to just shoot 1 take, but there was some kind of glitch and Starr had to jump in the water again, and then a 3rd time. Spinetti remembered, the 3rd time he was being dried off with a hairdryer and he said, "Oh Victor, I don't want to do this again." I asked why and he replied, "Because I can't bloody swim." Spinetti alerted the film crew, who'd had no idea, and they decided they could make do with the footage they had filmed rather than risk drowning the rock superstar for a 4th time.
We need protection. We've got a record to do tomorrow. I need protection.
With Beatlemania at its height in 1964, the band's North American tour took them to Canada for 1 show in Toronto and 2 in one day at the Forum in Montreal. When the group arrived at Dorval Airport, 120 members of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police did too, specifically to protect Starr. Montreal is the largest city in Quebec, a province culturally and linguistically aligned with France, as opposed to the more English-skewing rest of Canada. French-Canadian separatist groups calling for Quebecois independence have long operated out of the region, and before the Beatles arrived, one of those groups with an anti-Semitic bent sent death threats to the drummer. In the Beatles' anthology, Starr said, "Some people decided to make an example of me as an English Jew. The one major fault is I'm not Jewish. Threats we took on our stride. I mean, suddenly there would be a few more cops, but this was one of the few times I was really worried." As the band played the 4 p.m. and 8:30 p.m. shows at the Forum, a plainclothes police officer sat near Starr, while police snipers were placed around the venue. Starr recalled, "I had the cymbals up toward the audience to give me a bit of protection. I usually had them flat." Fortunately, there were no attempts on Starr's life that week, and the band left town safely after their final performance.
It never got in the way of the music, no matter how bad the row was. Once the count-in, we all gave our best.
In April 1970, Paul McCartney announced he was taking time off from the Beatles, and the temporary split turned permanent by the end of the year. The Beatles' breakup wasn't a surprise. The situation inside the band had been growing tense to the point of being unworkable since at least August 1968, during the recording of the White Album. In the Beatles' recording sessions, engineer Peter Vince revealed things were getting very strained on Beatles sessions by this time. The engineers would be asked to leave, and you'd know they were having heavy discussions and didn't want anyone around.
Watch any band, if anything goes wrong, they go. They all blame the drummer.
When the band finally fell apart in 1970, Starr took it harder than the other three, who were already at work on solo projects. In a 2015 interview with the Times of London, Starr admitted, "I was mad for 20 years. I had breaks in between of not being mad." Starr used heavy drinking to cope with the loss. Ultimately, that coping mechanism ended up wiping out many of his memories of the immediate post-Beatles era. Starr put it bluntly, saying, "I was drunk. Some of those years are absolutely gone." Starr and his first wife, Maureen, welcomed 2 sons, Zach in 1965 and Jason in 1967. Zach Starkey followed his father into the family business and became a rock and roll drummer, playing with Oasis, the Waterboys, and The Who. Starr's other son, Jason Starkey, also trained as a drummer, but had a tougher run in the wake of a sometimes contentious relationship with his rock god dad. He said to have once claimed, "Being Ringo's son is the biggest drag in my life. It's a total pain." Jason performed with a string of bands before he finally gave up drumming for good to pursue a career as a photographer and tour manager. But in 1987, when he was in his 20s, Jason found himself on the wrong side of the law after being found guilty of stealing a car radio. He got off with a 125-pound fine for that, but 2 years later, Jason was once again brought before a judge on a drug possession charge. After Apple Records began closing up shop in 1974, Starr was temporarily without a record label. So in mid-1975, he started his own, Ringo Records. While he was ostensibly in charge of the label, Starr signed deals with giant record companies to distribute his boutique's releases, Polydor Records in the UK and Atlantic Records in the United States. Unfortunately, the next chapter of the former Beatles' career as a solo musician and his first as a label boss was woefully unsuccessful. None of Starr's late 70s albums produced a hit single, and his album Ringo's Road to Grovior flopped hard on both sides of the Atlantic, despite including all 3 former Beatles on various tracks. Apart from Starr, the Ringo Records output wasn't notable. When Starr's friend Harry Nilsson opted to re-sign with RCA Records instead of jumping to Ringo, Starr ended up releasing music by little-known acts who never broke through commercially, including obscure acts like Johnny Warman, Stormer, Suzanne, David Henschel, and Bobby Keys. After sinking 3 years into the failing business, Starr dissolved Ringo Records at the end of 1978. Just after wrapping his 40th anniversary Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers tour, Petty, age 66, died on October 2, 2017, as a result of an accidental overdose of prescription painkillers. Petty had been using them to cope with a series of serious medical problems, including a broken hip, which left him in severe pain during his final shows. Petty's sudden death seriously unnerved Starr. He'd heard the news while he was in Las Vegas for a concert, one day after a shooting at the Route 91 Harvest Festival left 50 people dead and about 400 injured. Speaking of Billboard, Starr reflected, "Tom was a good friend. I played with Tom. Tom played with me. I got to know him over the years. Really got to know him when he was in the Traveling Wilburys. All through my career, we've lost really great friends and people who aren't my friends, but were great musicians and writers. In our business, we've lost them very young as well." All 4 of the Beatles famously hailed from Liverpool, one of England's largest cities and home to large populations of working and middle-class people. But while John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison all grew up in homes that were secure, if not wealthy, Starr's upbringing was a bit more economically unstable. As his childhood neighbor Marie Maguire Crawford was quoted in the Beatles, a biography, he was not a barefoot, ragged child, but like all of the families who lived in the Dingle, he was part of an ongoing struggle to survive. The Dingle was an especially depressed neighborhood full of tiny, decrepit homes with poor ventilation. The only place for kids to play was a local park, where all the coal smoke from area chimneys hung thick in the air. Those circumstances were made all the more trying when Starr's father abandoned the family when Ringo was only 3 years old. During the Beatles' time together, there was a through line of disrespect towards Ringo. He was only allowed to sing lead on 11 songs and write 2 unassisted, and he didn't even get to play on one of the group's earliest and biggest hits. Producer George Martin didn't like the drumming that Starr turned in for Love Me Do, so he brought in a session drummer named Andy White to play drums on that track and the B-side P.S. I Love You. Starr was demoted to playing the tambourine and maracas. Toward the end of the 1960s, the band life of the Beatles was famously contentious. It got so bad in 1968 for Starr that he briefly left the band in the middle of recording the White Album. As he described the situation, "I felt I wasn't playing great, and I also felt that the other 3 were really happy and I was an outsider." While Starr took his family on a vacation to Sardinia, the other Beatles recorded without him. They took bits and pieces of work he'd previously recorded and some new drum work by Paul McCartney to cobble together the rhythmic backing track for Back in the USSR. When Starr returned, his bandmates at least welcomed him back by covering his drum kit in flowers. After the Beatles split up in 1970, all 4 members enjoyed solo success. For his part, Starr had 8 singles in a row that all reached the top 10 in the US, including the #1 hits Photograph and You're 16. The albums Ringo and Goodnight Vienna went platinum and gold respectively, but then the public seemingly grew tired of what he was offering. In 1976, Ringo's Rotogravure stalled at number 28 on the US charts, and the singles A Dose of Rock and Roll and Hey Baby tanked as well. The 1977 and 78 albums Ringo IV and Bad Boy straight up flopped, reaching just number 162 and number 129 respectively on the Billboard chart. After Starr left his label over a dispute, it took him 3 years to record and release more music, with 1981's Stop and Smell the Roses. He enjoyed a modest comeback with the number 38 hit Rack My Brain, a song written by former bandmate George Harrison, but Stop and Smell the Roses sold so poorly that RCA Records dropped Starr. Starr met his first wife Maureen Cox at the Cavern Club, the venue where the Beatles cut their teeth. The two of them wed in 1965, had 3 children together, and the marriage weathered the storm of worldwide fame and attention, but just barely, and not as it turned out for the long haul.
Does that worry you, that the fact that, you can't go anywhere with him?
No, not really. I just sort of enjoy myself.
Cox had a brief affair with George Harrison. After she and Starr grew apart in the mid-70s, Starr struck up a relationship with model Nancy Lee Andrews, leading to a divorce which was finalized in 1975. According to John Lennon's first wife, Cynthia, Cox was so devastated that she attempted to take her own life by running a motorcycle into a wall. She survived, but endured a lengthy cosmetic surgery to correct her facial injuries. Starr and Cox both remarried, but they reportedly remained cordial. They stayed so friendly, in fact, that Starr was with his former wife when she passed away in December 1994. She underwent a bone marrow transplant from their son Zach that was intended to treat leukemia. Sadly, the procedure didn't completely improve her health, and she died from complications of the surgery at age 48. 1970 was the year that the Beatles split up, but Ringo at least had something in his personal life to celebrate that year as his first daughter and 3rd child overall was born. Lee Starkey stayed out of the spotlight for decades, unlike some other famous Beatles offspring, but then she made headlines in the fall of 1995 when she suddenly fell seriously ill. After collapsing and then being hospitalized in London, Lee Starkey was diagnosed with a brain tumor. After having fluid drained from her skull, she was transferred to Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, where a neurosurgeon performed an experimental 4-hour operation on her. The tumor was removed entirely and she was quickly discharged. Her father was reportedly by her bedside for the ordeal, and he stayed with her in Boston for 6 weeks after, when she underwent 8-minute radiation treatments every day. In 2001, the tumor returned and Starkey had to endure more medical treatments, but she thankfully managed to survive those as well.